It's Friday, May 8th, 2026. The Pentagon has been quietly scrubbing wounded troops from our own Iran casualty lists, and Washington Post satellite imagery shows the actual destruction at U.S. bases is far larger than anything the War Department has acknowledged. Meanwhile, the U.S. dropped 7 places to 64th in the global press freedom this week, somewhere between Botswana and Panama. And the Secretary of HHS told Congress there were no cuts to Medicaid. Meanwhile, the CBO puts the cuts at nearly $1 trillion over the next 10 years. When the numbers themselves go missing, we're seeing things through a different lens. I'm Richard Schreiber.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I bet Jeff Bezos wishes people would get back to watching that Melania documentary instead of having Washington Post satellites showing what's really going on. What we're watching isn't a series of missteps. It's a pattern, one that would have triggered the Fairness Doctrine on every licensed broadcaster in America had Ronald Reagan not dismantled it in 1987. That doctrine required verifiable truth as the baseline for public airwaves, which we certainly all want. That baseline is gone, however, and in its place is an administration that doesn't just spin the news, it edits the casualty list, and that's very concerning. I'm Tom Martin, and this is True Journalism.
Yes, welcome everybody. And we've talked before about the whole aspect of how the war is reported in the past. And we know from the Vietnam War through the Pentagon papers and such that wars don't always get the tacit approval or cooperation, if you will, of the federal government when it comes to reporting on things like casualties. We saw the same thing in Vietnam. Overstated casualties on the Vietnamese side by us. So I guess this is nothing new, but it seems like it's been ratcheted up a few levels in the current administration. We're at war in Iran, but what's really not being acknowledged at all is the full human cost. The gap between the official numbers and the independently verified reality is fairly significant. And this is arguably some of the most significant acts of institutional deception that we see in our modern military history. And we also know that this is happening on the Israel front, when the numbers of casualties and Palestinians is not being properly reported, and the level of destruction that's happening in Gaza. And now on the second front, in Lebanon, it's clear that these administrations don't really want you to see what is really going on.
Exactly. I know it's very concerning. Going back a few weeks, we all remember when Pete Hegseth and Trump's press secretary were saying, "What are you doing reporting casualties as a headline story? You really should be praising the president." No, we do not live in a totalitarian regime. And I think the least we can do for our courageous military personnel is to acknowledge what's really going on, to tell the truth. Again, we still don't know whether there's even a coherent story and why we have gone to war with Iran and what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz and whatnot. If brave men and women are being asked to give their life for our nation, the least we can do is be straightforward and tell the truth. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. As my family has good representation in the military. My dad was in the Navy. My sister was in Naval Reserves for 20 years. I think you're right. I think it's an affront to our military when we don't acknowledge the actual facts about their participation in war. And then we're hearing some horrible stories. I know that you mentioned just recently about improper food, improper protections, quasi-starvation conditions, I think, have been reported among the military. So, yeah, the message here is like listening to a mafia don talk about how henchmen are expendable in the whole context of things. And that really is just a horrible way of looking at this.
I really don't intend to bring up bad news, negativity at every turn. But again, in light of what you just said, my thoughts go back to a couple of years, I guess during the first Trump administration, when that reporter from The Atlantic magazine said he heard Trump talking about losers, just no respect for the military. And so if that
For a
is really
four-time draft dodger, yeah.
it's outrageous, and if it was just ineptitude, or they can't get their story quite straight about the reasons for being there and so on, okay, we're talking about ineptitude here, which is terrible. But when you add in the greed that we have covered several of these episodes, it just the contrast is just very disturbing, I have to say.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Fairness Doctrine previously, that the 1987 repeal under the Reagan administration, and the Iraq embedded journalist model, where war reporting being filtered through military channels, making independent verification structurally compromised, that's a real problem. And this year, 3 consecutive reports documented U.S. Central Command providing outdated casualty figures. In one instance, 15 wounded troops were quietly removed from the official tally without explanation. So, again, painting a different picture than reality in terms of the war reporting.
Absolutely, very disturbing.
And even further, as we mentioned earlier, the Washington Post satellite analysis which was this week. So commercially available imagery and footage shows at least 228 structures or pieces of equipment were damaged or destroyed on U.S. bases, far larger than what has been publicly acknowledged. There has been an attempt by the administration to tamp down on the actual damage on Iran, as well as potentially level up some of our activities and the damage that we've inflicted in return. Pentagon statements call the Iranian strikes largely unsuccessful. It doesn't seem largely unsuccessful to me when that level of damage is done.
I can't resist throwing this in. I know that you're very prolific on Substack there. I enjoy writing on Substack. I need to get back into it a bit, but I've been thinking about an essay that I really want to write for Substack, and that is, believe it or not, my conversation with Donald Trump. This was prior to the first administration. I was in a public television. I don't know if I've told you about this, Richard, but I was in a public TV studio, and they were taping a 1-hour special co-produced by a fellow who was the founder of the Learning Annex, if you remember the Learning Annex.
Yes. Yeah.
And
wow. Back in the
whole thing
1980s.
it was some title like How You Two Can Get Rich or something like that. And so I had been to the real estate expo that they did at the Javits Center. Again, thanks.
Me too. Yeah.
Bill Zanker, the founder of the Learning Annex, and Tony Robbins spoke there, and Robert,
Yes.
and whatnot.
This is
Trump
2008.
about prenups. It's like, okay, people are waiting to hear, all these real estate investors waiting to hear what Donald Trump is going to talk. He's going to talk about Paul McCartney and prenups. It's, oh my God. But they did ask before the taping, they said, would anyone like to ask Mr. Trump a question? I said, I would like to ask Mr. Trump a question. And a couple of minutes later, they handed me a card, said, okay, here's your question. I thought I was going to be able to ask him a question. What's going on here? And the question they wanted me to ask, for Mr. Trump told them to have somebody ask him this question, is, Mr. Trump, so many people talk about the power of positive thinking, but you talk about the power of negative thinking. What do you mean by that? And as I hear about what's going on in the Straits of Hormuz, whether that was even factored in to the original plan, and then the discrepancy of what's really going on there, and as you just reported, the damage that's not being acknowledged, did Mr. Trump, our president, really listen to his own advice? What's the worst that can happen here? Let's prepare for it, and let's tell the truth to the public. So I was just thinking back to that conversation.
I think we went to the same conference. Yes, it was Trump and Robert Kiyosaki, and I remember Tony Robbins speaking for about 2 hours. That was the best part of it. But yeah, in typical fashion, Trump stayed strayed from the script a little bit.
And he was very practical. And this was before, I don't know if possibly even before he had the idea that he was going to run for office, that he was very proud that the Learning Annex, Bill Zanker and company were paying him $1 million a speech in LA, Chicago, New York, and so on. And it was a big draw. They filled the Javits Center. The other speakers were big draws also, but he was the
top line after Kiyosaki. Yes, for sure.
Yes.
So, but public support for military action tracks directly with perceived costs. The administration has cited its own reported casualty numbers as proof that the war is going extremely well. And we talked about the numbers too, right? Hegseth asked for I forget the number, in the tens of billions of dollars. And he was brought before a congressional committee, I believe, last week to talk about this, and really couldn't articulate where the money, what it was really intended for, or the status of the war. And there's been some rumors, not that we're here to report them, but there's been some concerns over the stockpile being significantly depleted in terms of our rockets, our Patriot, all of the different types of artillery and armory and rocket fire that we use, that we've depleted our resources. And then
That could have implications regarding China and Taiwan.
although President Trump quickly stepped in to remind people that we have some of these American-made components apparently on foreign bases scattered throughout the world, but there seemed to be some question as to the veracity of that comment. And why this really all matters, Tom, is if the public can't trust what the body count is, which is a really indelicate way of putting it, I apologize. We can't really be informed enough to give our proper consent on the war. This has largely been an executive action type of war. We know Congress wasn't even contacted, or it wasn't pre-discussed with them. And we just passed the 60-day limit, and that's quietly gone by which the president does have to inform Congress as to the status.
War Powers Act, and
Exactly.
Nexstar leaders were saying we pressed pause versus cease. I know you
With
put
the
out
ceasefire.
some memes of video games, but no, this is not a video game. You can't press pause. Anyway.
Yeah. So, and obviously the numbers clearly state that most Americans were against the war. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the reason for the war has never really been cogently explained, or it has been explained, but not backed up with facts. There's been a lot of disagreement by many people, and especially people in the armed forces and some of the generals, to say that there was really no imminent attack or imminent threat from Iran. And even the New York Times came up with an article this past week where two of their senior reporters actually reported on and did an investigative piece on the internal cabinet, or the tight circle that Trump apparently had around making the decision whether to go to war or not, which was himself, the vice president, Hegseth, someone from the Joint Chiefs, and of course, Marco Rubio, who normally would be very hands-on and involved. That's what the Secretary of State's supposed to be. But we all know that Rubio months ago said that he has nothing to do with setting foreign policy. That's all Donald Trump. But it was interesting throughout even his own inner circle. Rubio was apparently, according to the article, was not committed one way or the other. But when you're dealing with Donald Trump, if you don't go with him in lockstep, that's actually going against him. So one could argue that Rubio was not in support of the war. Obviously, we know that Vice President Vance was not for the war, but again, showing his loyalty to Donald Trump, said he would go along with it. Hegseth apparently thought it was a good idea. And perhaps others. So there was even some division within the inner circle.
And of course, reported that in the past, when he was a senator, Rubio spoke all in favor of the War Powers Act, that we do need congressional approval for something.
Yes, absolutely. And talking with a number of people, Rubio on many levels seems to be somewhat of a voice of reason within this collective. He's obviously someone with a long, whether you like him or not, he's had a long and an impressive political career. He's been an effective politician throughout his career, but he's distanced himself from a lot of the typical MAGA rhetoric at times. And we've all seen some of the interesting and curious meetings with foreign dignitaries, as well as the oil industry in the past, where there's some curious exchanges back and forth. But so I don't even know where we are with the war right now, because as we said in prior programs, the message that we're getting out of Washington often conflicts with the messaging coming from Iran. And the gap has been so severe.
As Stephen Colbert said, are we really expected to believe a fascistic totalitarian leader like Donald Trump? So anyway.
Or should we pay more attention to Iran? And I think there's a point that we've all seen the Lego videos on YouTube, which are pretty funny, but also are based in some kind of factual narratives. Again, from their point of view, I want to be clear about that. But you mentioned Stephen Colbert, and I know his last show is on May 21st. And on one hand, I can say, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. On the other hand, I'm not, because he's been very enthusiastically criticizing, obviously, some of the movements by the government, and which is the role of comedians. Certainly, the correspondence dinner would have been very interesting and very likely heavily influenced by some of the comedians that were lined up to speak out. And I know there's been a lot of thoughts on social media that that whole incident was staged to avoid the conference from actually taking place. And even though the president said it would be rescheduled, I think we all know that's never going to happen. But let's talk about Colbert's going off the air in 2 weeks. Both Melania and Trump have attempted to influence ABC to remove Jimmy Kimmel again from the air, and apparently got a little bit more aggressive. And mind you, Jimmy Kimmel does cross the line with some of his comments. I think he's influenced by the fact that there's something personal going on between him and Trump that dates back for some time. But again, that's all kind of a lead into the comment that I made earlier, that the U.S. press is now ranked 64th globally by an independent organization that measures the press's effectiveness and the press's ability to really report on the news effectively and accurately and truthfully for its nation. So, yeah, we're somewhere between the Philippines and other countries, or Panama, sorry, and we've really moved down on that list quite a bit. Interestingly enough, we weren't that highly ranked even before this current administration. And we've talked often about the kind of steep decline that American journalism has really undertaken because of the partisan impact and the propaganda that is arguably sown by both sides. We're not going to indict anyone in particular. But yeah, journalism today is a microcosm of what our government has become. And that's on both sides, really. It's divisive, political, contradictory, oftentimes very uncivil. That's why we've sunk to 64th globally. I don't think we can totally attribute that, or even partially attribute that, to the direction that we are headed, which is an authoritarian takeover of the media in this country. We've seen it with CBS. We also saw the commentary from the Ellison family, even being so outspoken, as you mentioned, to say things like, as soon as this deal goes through and acquiring Paramount, which if we had an FCC or government agencies would prevent it purely on antitrust. But these days are not the days of the past. Already talking about, oh, we're going to apply the same rule set to CNN that we've done at CBS. And we know what that means, because I know you, please remind us what's happened at CBS News today and where it's heading even further under the new leadership that was appointed by Ellison at the behest of the Trump administration.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And there's a story out just today, as we're recording this, that the CBS 60 Minutes correspondent Sharyn Alfonsi, who did that much discussed story about the prison in South America where ICE agents were sending people rounding up off the streets of our country, terrible conditions there, and so on. And apparently her contract as a correspondent expires at the end of this month. And it's been announced within the organization it will not be renewed. She's contacted a lawyer who's represented people like Megyn Kelly and Don Lemon and some others. It's just very confrontational. It echoes what President Trump is doing with targeting his enemies. Can I get them on their mortgage loans?
Yeah.
That's it.
Or
It's like-
get them on inappropriately organizing seashells on the beach
Exactly. The famous seashell.
for James Comey, which is,
I know.
I believe that will be thrown out faster than the previous attempt to indict him was. But again, it's just posturing and intimidation that we know. And yeah, unfortunately, executing a retribution methodology on the press, unfortunately, which is, I think it's emboldened some people. You mentioned Substack. With a lot of authors are writing in Substack, which is a completely open environment and community. I mean, if you read the stuff Dan Rather is putting out on a daily basis, I don't think anyone comes close to his level of scrutiny or criticism of the administration. And again, he's someone who's been reporting on these things for, I don't want to show my age, Tom, but 60 years or more.
I think he was there at the JFK assassination.
Like 1963 in Dallas. You're right
Yeah.
about that. He was a stringer for a local Houston television station at the time.
Sure.
And I think he was one of the early ones to break that JFK had passed. But I think this, and interestingly enough, whereas with other authoritarian regimes, they usually send in these secret police to close the television stations. I know Putin abolished the free press in Russia. I know China has a similar scenario. Here, they're doing it through billionaire acquisition, which is certainly not illegal. One could argue it might be unethical or obviously not upholding the spirit of what true journalism is about. But as the Ellison family continues to consolidate its media empire and implement the rule set that's pro-administration, and we talked about 60 Minutes is going to undergo a significant rehab and under the new CBS News director.
That's what we hear. That's what we hear. Billionaires do some good as well. I'm not hearing that Jeff Bezos is going to bring back another season of The Apprentice. We should be grateful for small favors, don't you think?
Yeah, I missed out on the Met Gala. I didn't have an extra $100,000 to throw around to attend that.
It's a $10 million for Mr. and Mrs. Bezos, exactly. Yeah. The event coincided with the release of The Devil Wears Prada 2. And Meryl Streep said, I will not be, I think she says every year, no, I will not be attending. This year, I really will not be attending. And it's just the contrast. Again, if it was just ineptitude in the White House, okay, that's sad, but okay. But just the contrast between garret, greed, and opulent burning of money with the sacrifice that so many people are being asked to make, even with the price of gasoline.
Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, $1 trillion in cuts over 10 years to Medicaid is going to have an incredibly harmful effect on people with disabilities. I run an autism foundation in New York, inspired by my daughter. It's going to affect IEP coverage in schools.
Wow.
These cuts that came out of DOGE, some of the cuts came out of DOGE initially, just wiping out entire government agencies, as well as the grant process. Many government grants have been put on hold, defunded, tossed away, and those grants are for good causes and to help people in need. So, again, back keeping this within the framework of journalism, but we don't really hear a lot about these things being reported in the news unless it personally affects you, like it does myself and others in that space.
When someone, I'm sure it's not just one journalist, but I saw someone writing about the cuts that will take place following the midterm elections in November. They don't want the pain to.
You don't want the pain to take place so that it's noticeable and would affect the voters. Gosh, God forbid. And then obviously with the election coming up, the gerrymandering, the repealing of some of the Voter Protection Act stuff that we saw in various states happening, and with the Supreme Court basically unraveling some of that as well. Yeah, it's these are very difficult items to report on from a journalism standpoint. And if you do, you can expect backlash or worse, or perhaps silencing, which we don't want to see. Speaking of silencing, I know someone who was very influential in your life passed away this week. That, of course, being Captain's Courageous, Ted Turner.
Exactly. What an icon in journalism with the family billboard company and
Yep.
it's a superstation and whatnot. It's been interesting. I do pay attention to a lot of CNN coverage, and not surprisingly, they've had some amazing tributes there with people who worked with him at the beginning. Talk about that coverage of the Iraq War
Yes.
way back in the beginning. It just sounds like he was a breath of fresh air to news coverage, saying we have a responsibility. You and I have talked about do the people running these news organizations still feel a sense of civic responsibility? Clearly, Ted Turner did and had a big vision. It got a lot of ridicule saying people don't really want 24/7. So this was long before the internet, of course. He believed that people do need to know what's going on. Can't be contained within the boundaries of a 30-minute evening newscast. And he also put power in the hands of journalists, some of them very young at that time, Christian Amanpour, Wolf Blitzer, and people like that. So it's just hearing people pay tribute to him in recent days brought back, boy, we could use that, a lot more of that right now. I have to give him credit for taking the lead back in those early days.
Yeah, he was a maverick and clearly a visionary. And I think cable news was really, I remember the initial thrust was during the Iranian hostage crisis when Ted Koppel first started that evening news program, which was after the 11 o'clock news. And that ran for over a year. And then I think ultimately it persisted. And then the war in the first Gulf War that you mentioned, CNN was actually invited by the Bush senior administration to kind of come along and fill the war objectively. And that was it. There's obviously a different kind of world, different place in the world, round the clock coverage. And he was right. He proved that people did have an appetite for round the clock news.
And it was interesting. So many aspects of his story are interesting, but a couple of people they interviewed said that when he was with, I think it's Gorbachev, that he brought with CNN's coverage to Russia and even brought it into North Korea, because again, it's let it speak for itself. Those regimes have certainly changed a lot over the years as well. But just the idea that there was once a time when, that what the coverage really is, the truth. It's not, is it the truth? Is it the distortion? Is it total spin? It was amazing that there was once a time when that happened.
Yeah. So a journalist's tool is something called a parallel count, where you build a shadow data set from non-government sources, hospital records, congressional testimony, independent journalists, and compare that to the actual official tally. The divergence is the story, especially today. And this was aimed for Seymour Hersh's Vietnam methodology, where there was a lot of that same kind of disparity that we're seeing play out in the Iran war. So when the official number doesn't match the sources closest to the event, the official number is the anomaly, not the reporter's number. So that's the space that we're in now. But we have governments that are putting in place some pretty strict rules, threatening treason for disclosing information on the ground, or certainly Israel has imposed those restrictions on its own people reporting on the war condition, and we're not that far off. All right, so we're going to wrap up with our rapid fire news segment. The first event that happened this week to talk about, Tom, was RFK denying Medicaid cuts. He denies Medicaid cuts. The HHS Secretary Kennedy told Congress there are no cuts in Medicaid under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But the CBO estimates that the law cuts federal Medicaid by $911 billion over a decade, as I reported earlier, almost $1 trillion. eliminating coverage for 13.1 million people by 2035. And that's through factcheck.org, who verified and validated the numbers. Next item on our dais is the Supreme Court guts the Voter Rights Amendment, Louisiana versus Calais, in a 6-3 ruling. It was framed as stopping unconstitutional racial gerrymandering by the state. And it's interesting. I saw a gentleman, it was a black gentleman, who responded very aggressively to this. I was in front of a congressional hearing, and I saw the YouTube clip of that, basically refuting all of the points on that. So the plaintiffs must now prove discriminatory intent, not just the fact. So the gunning of Section 2 of the 1965 Voters' Rights Act was undertaken by the Supreme Court. Next, the FCC approves Nexstar-Tegna merger. The FCC chairman Carr called the $6.2 billion deal consolidation that strengthens local news. One company now reaches 80% of U.S. TV households by 259 stations. No full commissioner vote was even held. 8 state attorney generals filed suit to block it. And this from NPR and public knowledge. We used to think that less choices for the consumer was bad. Now it looks like that no longer matters. And then we talked about the U.S. falling to 64th in the global press freedom rankings out of 180 nations between Botswana and Panama, citing Trump's systematic weaponization of state institutions against the press, that coming right from the organization. And then finally, May Day protests dismissed as fringe. Administrative officials and the right-wing media called the May 1st demonstrations a fringe, radical event with no broad public support. The reality is thousands of protests occurred nationwide. NPR and PBS documented participation from parents, teachers, veterans, and small business owners. All righty, so this week, 15 troops got scrubbed by the Pentagon casualty list without explanation. A cabinet secretary denied $911 billion in documented cuts of Medicaid to Congress. And the U.S. Press Corps fell to 64th in the world and marked Press Freedom Day with silence from the White House. When you turn the body count into talking points, folks, you've already lost the war that matters the most, which is the truth.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Legacy isn't built on body count management. It's built on what your soldiers believe they died for, as we were discussing a minute ago, and whether the people who sent them told the truth. The Fairness Doctrine fell in 1987, as we discussed. Talked about now the United States is 64th in press freedom this year, 2026. And if you're not demanding verifiable sources, you're not consuming the news, you're consuming its absence, which is not... You don't want to steer a boat with that rudder. That's how I look at it.
Oh, for sure. I totally concur. So the invisible toll this week is not just the casualties uncounted, it's the truth that was untold. Build your foundation, folks, on reality. Check your sources, and we'll see you out there on the next wire.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.
And as Edward R. Murrow would say at the end of every broadcast, good night and good luck. We'll see you next week.